Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rosa Balfour. I'm the Director of Carnegie Europe, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this debate on NATO 2030, Adapting to a New World. The occasion for this debate is provided by the publication of a report entitled NATO 2030 United for a New Era. The report was crafted by 10 experts invited by the Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg to reflect independently on NATO's relevance, its strengths, its weaknesses, and to make proposals for NATO to adapt to a changing world. I'd like to mention the group of independent experts that have contributed to this effort. The group includes John Bew from the UK, Greta Bossenmeier from Canada, Anja Dalgaard Nielsen from Denmark, Marta Dassou from Italy, Thomas de Maizière from Germany, Anna Fotoya from Poland, Ambassador Tajan Ildem from Turkey, Wes Mitchell from the US, Hubert Védrine from France, and Herna Verhagen from the Netherlands. You can see on your screen links to the report and also to the group members and their bios. So before our panel discussion on this report, I would like to pass this virtual floor to NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who initiated this process, for some opening remarks, and I hope some indications of how NATO will make good use of this report. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rosa, and many thanks to Carnegie for hosting today's event. A year ago, NATO leaders asked me to future-proof our alliance by making NATO stronger politically and fit to face any challenge. And this is why I launched NATO 2030, to make our strong alliance even stronger for the next decade and beyond. To support my work, as you said, I appointed a group of 10 independent experts. 5 women and 5 men, who represent the diversity of our alliance and brings a depth of knowledge and experience from their respective fields. After months of hard work and many consultations, all virtual, last week the group delivered a substantial report. So today I want to thank each and every one of them. Anja, Anna, Greta, Erna, Hubert, John, Marta and Tajan. And a special thanks to Thomas and Wess for your able stewardship. I am really delighted that you are both here to represent the group today. Your report is a valuable input to NATO 2030. I will continue my consultations over the coming months, and I will put forward a number of strategic level recommendations at the next NATO summit when NATO leaders meet in 2021. Earlier this fall, I stated that the time has come for a new strategic concept for NATO, and this should be one of the outcomes of NATO 2030. And I welcome that the group has also included this in their report, because our security environment has dramatically changed over the last 10 years and will continue to change. So we must continue to adapt. Your report shows that we build on strong foundations. It confirms that NATO is strong and is agile, because we have been able to adapt both militarily and politically. Since 2014, we have responded to a changing security environment, delivering on our military responsibilities with modern capabilities, higher readiness, and increased investment in defense. We have also adapted politically by increasing political consultation among allies on issues that matter for our shared security, including arms control, emerging and disruptive technologies and resilience. Political consultation and decision-making are in action every day at NATO. When I launched the NATO 2030 project earlier this year, I outlined 3 priorities. To remain a strong military alliance, become stronger politically, and take a more global approach. Keeping NATO strong militarily is essential for our security. Our success as an alliance is based on our unity and the strength of our military forces. This is why the commitment to invest more in defense and to achieve fairer burden sharing is as relevant as ever. Looking at 2030, we need to continue to demonstrate our solidarity in tangible ways, in particular by providing the forces, capabilities and resources needed to defend the Euro-Atlantic area. To remain a strong military alliance, we also must continue to modernize and invest in innovation. In a world where bytes and big data are as important as bullets and battleships, NATO should play a greater role in helping to preserve our technological edge. Our strong militaries must be able to rely on resilient societies. Resilience is our first line of defense. So, as part of NATO 2030, we should strengthen and broaden our commitment to the resilience of our critical infrastructure and assets. NATO also needs to be stronger politically. This is the only place where North America and Europe meet every day to discuss, decide and act together. For NATO to become stronger politically, we must continue to acknowledge that yes, we have our differences. We have had them in the past and we have them now. Open and frank exchanges can be difficult, but they are essential to foster unity and solidarity, and to work towards common approaches. Finally, a more global alliance does not mean a change of focus for NATO. We are a regional alliance and we will remain a regional alliance. But the challenges we face are increasingly global. From terrorism and climate change to the rise of China and its implications for the global balance of power, the international order and our own security. To address these challenges, we need to work together even closer as allies, to defend the rules-based international order and to uphold the norms and values that enable us to live freely and in prosperity. We also need to cooperate even more closely with our partners near and far, to stand together as a community of like-minded democracies. NATO 2030 is an opportunity to renew and strengthen the transatlantic bond, to ensure we continue to adapt, to keep our people safe, today, for 2030 and beyond. So let me thank the whole group of experts for its excellent work. And many thanks to Carnegie and everyone watching online for your support and interest in NATO 2030.
Thank you very much, Secretary General, for your opening remarks. And now we can move on to our panel. I'd like to just highlight a couple of sentences and words that were mentioned. The Secretary General talked about making NATO future-proof, and the report mentions the fact that past adaptation is no guarantee of future success. And I think it's quite remarkable if we look back at how much NATO has adapted over time, historically. It has enlarged in terms of composition and numbers, and it has embraced a broader variety of policy areas and security challenges. And it has done so usually with the aid of independent reports from reflection groups that have supported the policy and political choices that NATO leaders faced. I would say that by comparison to previous strategic concepts, this one is much more global in terms of horizon, and it's much more focused also on political cohesion. And I think these are two of the themes that stand out quite clearly. And in order to discuss these themes and others, we have the two co-chairs of the group with us, Thomas de Maizière, who is a member of the German Parliament and also a former Minister of Defence, a former Minister of Interior, and has a long political career. Wes Mitchell is the Vice Chairman of the Board of the Centre for European Policy Analysis, and also a former US Assistant Secretary for Eurasian and European Affairs between 2017 and 2019. And we're joined by two security and defense experts based here in Europe, Alexandra de Scheffer, who is also a former colleague of mine. She is from the German Marshall Fund of the US, and she is the Director of Research of the Transatlantic Security Program and head of the Paris office. And Anna Wieslander, who is the Director for Northern Europe at the Atlantic Council and the Secretary General of the Swedish Defence Association. So let's start our discussion with some opening remarks from the two co-chairs. I'd like to invite Thomas de Maizière to give us, what are the main points of analysis and also what are the main takeaways of this exercise that you conducted. And as Secretary General said, in rather inhospitable conditions, in the sense that you weren't actually able to meet as a group and you had to do everything virtually. Thomas, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Very good. So Jens and all the others, thank you for your interest. Yes, it was a unique process that we never met, but it was unique as well because of the group. It was an extremely good group and full of knowledge, full of compromise, full of experience. The second reason for our report is an excellent cooperation between Wess and me. It was really outstanding, and then great help from a lot of aides, especially NATO headquarters, PPU, and others. So we discussed a lot, and with Jens, the NEC, and the experts about the tone of the report, the character, because. There was a bit concern within NATO if you describe the situation too negative, like Macron did, then you disencourage everybody, and it's not true. And on the other hand, when you describe the situation as wonderful and nothing to change, then everybody would ask, well, why was Macron saying that? And is there nothing to change? So the right tone between these two extremes was very important, and we think we found it, and some quote the praise and some quote the criticism. You can only judge the whole report when you read both elements. So this was important for us. And then that was Jens mentioned a minute ago, is we wanted, and this was our mandate, to strengthen the political arm of NATO, the political tool, the tools, the instruments, and things like that. There's a success story on the military side since 2014, but the political side is lacking behind, and so this was the main focus of our work. I will concentrate on internal themes and just very shortly touch the points internal one, and Wess will continue. Internally, what we think what is needed is what one of our experts told: a new culture of consultations, a new culture of debates. It's a bit frozen there, full of rituals. And we know, and we discussed it among ourselves, that this is more a question of a political will. You cannot recommend methods to do so if the political will is lacking. But nevertheless, we recommended some of those instruments to increase and to the debates and make them more lively. One is a pledge for a code of conduct. You've read it. I think this is a good instrument to promise yourself, to promise ourselves to do better work together. Then the debate on a strategic concept itself will have a strength to make the debates more lively, probably. And this is exactly the reason why some countries were concerned about that. They said, well, these discussions will decrease the cohesion and not increase. We said, well, if this is the case, then the strategic concept is even more important to debate it. So this is a second element. And then you've read it, more ministerial meetings, not only in Brussels, more informal meetings, perhaps broaden the formats to include the private sector, other ministries, and things like that. I think these are recommendations to increase the character of the political character of the debates and make NATO again the political forum for security discussions among the allies. And then second point, internally decision making. Of course, we've heard the concerns. We discussed even more provocative issues, by the way, but it's a secret because we didn't recommend it, but we discussed it anyway. But we found a consensus here that consensus is the bedrock of everything. We will not touch it. But consensus cannot be an excuse to sit aside and say no. So we recommend some procedural but very political issues. One is to raise the possibility for blockages on the ministerial level. This increases the political price to do so. Then a stronger role for Secretary General. Then an easier way to build coalitions for those countries who want to do more with the allowance of others. So in a way, this is a variation of a constructive abstention. You can go what you want to do under NATO Chapuis. I will not be part of it. This type of decision making can be done more often. Perhaps there are other ideas, but just to refuse these ideas and stick at these very not strong enough, not quick enough decision-making processes would be a big mistake. Now, externally, because in the question of time, I only want to just touch the points. We've heard about the updated strategy concept. We very much underline that. And because of another reason as well. If you look, we are on an open line here, but the military documents are far ahead from the political ones. And this is not correct from a democratic point of view. It's not right to do so. This is one additional reason why it's urgently needed. Then other recommendation to make really the discussions between NATO and the EU honest. There is so much wording, so many speeches, and very much to do on real substance. And this is one of our recommendations. Then to make emergent and disruptive technologies really to a political strategic priority. It's easy to say, to do so, but it's not easy it's easy to talk about that, but it's not easy to do so. There are committees, there are experts, we know that, there are researchers, there's another group underway, but it's not really a political issue how EDTs influences the security policy within NATO and towards NATO. And so our recommendation is to have a summit there together with private sector is at least a push to do so. Then to involve EDTs in arms control talks, I think this is a new idea. It's not very realistic for next year or the next year, for the next two next years, but perhaps there are interests from other players to talk about that. And then to make really an interest-driven strategic use of our partnerships. I think this is not only in the Indo-Pacific, but especially there, but all over the world. I think this is crucial for to build an alliance of Western democracies without memberships, but not to be demand-driven, but interest-driven using these partnerships. So this was long enough. You've read it. I wanted to underline the internal dimension of political cohesion. And with having said that, I would like to pass the floor with your alliance to my friend Wess.
Please, Wes, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Rosa. I just want to say what an honor it is to be on the call today, and I appreciate Carnegie organizing this opportunity to present the report in public. It's always, of course, a pleasure to appear alongside my co-chair and good friend, Thomas, and of course, warm greetings to the other group members who are able to join us for the call. And I have to say at the top, really how much I appreciate Secretary General Stoltenberg's warm words to our group. We are all very grateful for the trust that he showed in asking us to prepare this report. And of course, along the way over the last 8 months, all of the support and direction that he and his team at NATO have provided to us throughout the process. Thomas and I made a point at the very start of the reflection process that we wanted our group to embody the spirit of Atlantic cooperation, not only in the final product, but in our comportment as a group. And I think all of our group members take a lot of pride in having accomplished that goal. And you see that not least in the fact that the document is a consensus document. It carries the imprimatur of all 10 group members. And I think that in a microcosm demonstrates the solidarity in a practical way that we are counseling to NATO. So I was happy that we were able to supply such a document. I will assume that most of the people on the call have either had a chance to peruse the report or look at some of the main takeaways, read some of the press. And I think Thomas has done an outstanding job just now of covering a lot of the most important waterfront in the recommendations. So I'll just restrict myself to maybe a handful of observations on how we approached the task and some of the main strategic themes of the report. The first of those, and I think this is important to state up front, is that our task was very much, as Jens indicated, to look ahead. I would say to look ahead and not backward. Jens asked us to look out to 2030 and provide recommendations for strengthening the political dimension of the NATO alliance, and specifically in 3 areas: political role and tools with regard to emerging threats, political cohesion and unity, and political consultation and decision making. And we took that assignment very seriously and stayed faithful to it throughout the process, which is to say, what the report is not is an extension by other means of the day-to-day debates in the North Atlantic Council. Of course, we were aware of those debates. We were aware of political dynamics in the transatlantic relationship, but we were very conscientious in not allowing those to dominate our thinking. I think you could say that our approach was inductive rather than deductive, in the sense that we looked ahead to the world as it's likely to exist in 2030. And then in a sense, we reasoned backwards. We examined each of those 3 objectives that Jens had given us in the light of that emerging world, that emerging strategic context. So we asked, in essence, does NATO possess the tools? Does it have the cohesion? Does it have the habits of consultation that it'll need for the world of 2030? And then we drew conclusions accordingly. All of that is to say, we wanted to build something that would last. We wanted to provide analysis and recommendations that would be valid, irrespective of what happened in the American elections, irrespective of political events in other NATO capitals. So I hope people will read it in that light. Second, the premise of the report, and I also think this is very important to state, even if there are a lot of veteran NATO hands on the call, the premise is that strategic adaptation is the means by which NATO survives. It's the means by which NATO shows value to its members. This is an alliance that has endured for 70 years for a reason, and that is its ability to accurately read the cues of its external environment. So, every few generations, as Rosa eloquently articulated, NATO re-examines how the environment around it is changing and then deliberately modifies itself to better fit that environment. That's a sign of life and health. And if President Macron's comment helped to provide a prompt or an opening for that periodic, necessary, beneficial review, then I think that's all to the good. The key to grasp, though, and this is what I would stress, is that NATO's adaptation has never just been military. It's also been about adapting NATO's political ambition and role. And you see that throughout NATO history. We made a point in the four sections of in the front sections of the report to elaborate what that process has been and what it has yielded. A lot of what we take for granted in NATO today, in patterns or rhythms of consultation or assumptions about NATO's political voice, are in fact they're outgrowths of previous moments of political self-reflection and adaptation. A third point is an important one too, and it's prioritization. The group examined a lot of emerging global trends, and I'm proud of how we gave due weight and consideration to a fairly comprehensive set of dynamics facing NATO over the next decade. However, I think I can venture to say it was manifestly clear from our consultations with experts and with allies that the most important single trend or characteristic of the world looking out to 2030 is strategic competition with Russia and China. And we say that so often in policy circles that it can become maybe a little bit trite. So I think it's important to be clear that what we're talking about is a very different environment than NATO knew, certainly in the immediate post-Cold War period or after 9/11. But also that this is not just a material, this is strategic rivalry with Russia and China is not just a material one, but it's ideological as well. These are both large authoritarian powers, and I think the report has a lot of clarity on that point. And it's also clear in our report that Russia will remain the primary military threat to NATO for the foreseeable future, but that the rise of China is the single biggest, most consequential change in NATO's strategic environment, and one that the alliance really has to reckon with. And I think this is all important to state because it gets at a fundamental why of NATO. That NATO, when you consider that strategic picture that I've just described, is the only organization or platform that can be the principal venue for organizing the countries of the Euro-Atlantic space, the countries of the West, for competition with large, aggressive, authoritarian rivals. And a special word here on China, just briefly. I think in our deliberations, the message resurfaced over and over again from allies, large and small, that China is already active in the Euro-Atlantic space in ways that undermine NATO cohesion and weaken the alliance. And it's not only an economic partner, it's not only an Asia-Pacific actor. And so I think it was incumbent upon our report to reflect that fact. So our report, I think, is clear about the centrality of those big main challenges, but it also makes it clear that NATO has to have the ability to deal with those while handling other urgent matters, the threat of terrorism, which certainly hasn't gone away, other global man-made and natural pressures, which all I think come across in the report. But in all of these cases, the report's message is that NATO's efficacy is rooted in its political cohesion. And so at its heart, I think the report is an examination of why and how that cohesion can be strengthened ahead of a more challenging era. Finally, I want to say a word about the end goal of all of these recommendations. That our report, its aim was to deliver recommendations to policymakers that are politically and practically plausible. So I think we scrutinized a lot of recommendations. We debated a lot of possible suggestions. We heard a lot from experts and officials, and we really tried to focus in on indeed what is plausible in a practical and political sense for NATO. And in that sense, I think the report is grounded in a kind of steadiness or realism. Ultimately, NATO's political health is, of course, a question of political will. And that's not something you can just manufacture. Certainly, a group of experts can't manufacture that. It's up to governments and it's up to the publics of NATO. But the job of our report, I think, was very specific and very, very beneficial, and that is to give recommendations for how to strengthen the incentives for allies to use NATO more fully as it can and should be used. And so just by placing on the table some of the themes that are in the report, I think our hope was to create an opening for those in NATO who are serious about the preservation and reform of the alliance to creatively explore options for doing that. So we hope NATO leaders will use that opening and the potential that it creates to discuss and debate things that can be discussed in a new and different way because they were placed on the table, irrespective of whether each of the recommendations is taken in its letter. Obviously, we would love that many of them are, but I think it's also just the spirit of creating that opening for self-examination. And I would just say in closing, man, I think on the basis of NATO's successful transformation of the last several years, if you consider where NATO was at in 2013 going into 2014, and then you look at the historic adaptation, not just militarily but politically, that it's undertaken in the period since Russia went into Ukraine, I think we have a very well-founded optimism that NATO will continue to adapt in that fashion for the challenges we describe in the report. So with that, let me say again what an honor it has been to be a part of the reflection group and to serve alongside Thomas, and thanking the other group members, and of course Jens and his crew, and thank you to Carnegie for giving us this opportunity today. Over.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you both, not just for synthesizing so effectively both content and analysis and the recommendations. There are actually rather a lot of recommendations, so it's very hard to be brief. But I'd also like to thank you for enlightening us on the process and the choices that you made in the course of this exercise, because I think it's very interesting to see how you were dealing with the priorities and dealing with the different views within the group, and of course the needs to do so virtually. Now, I'd like to pass the floor to Alexandra to start with. And Alexandra, I'd like to invite you to say a few words about this issue of political cohesion. Of course, Macron has been referred to 2 or 3 times already because of his provocative comments about NATO being brain dead a few months ago in The Economist. And I was wondering, so I know Macron and Stoltenberg spoke last night. I was wondering, given you are based in Paris and you know that community very well, if you could share with us some comments on how this report has been received in France, but also more generally, how do you think this will address some of the issues and the divisions that have emerged within NATO recently, especially with respect to the East Mediterranean, for instance, and there have been other spats, and it has been said that there have been divisions in the past. There's nothing new, but how do the recommendations in the report address the recent ones, and how do they help build a common strategic culture?
Thank you, Rosa, and thank you for your invitation. I'm very happy to see Wess Mitchell, Thomas de Maizière again, and to share the panel with Anna Wieslander. So thank you for putting this panel together. I mean, I really enjoyed reading this report, and the echoes you have here in Paris are quite positive, which from a French perspective is a huge compliment, as you know. I think this report to me is what I would call a reality check report, because as both Thomas de Maizière and Wess Mitchell just mentioned, it addresses not only the need for NATO to adapt to the fastly changing international environment, which is by definition part of what a military alliance should constantly do to remain relevant. And a military alliance, by definition, is permeable to its external environment. So it is constantly updating itself and adapting itself to external threats. But it also takes into account the tensions inside the alliance and addresses the issue of political cohesion, which, as most of you just reminded, is precisely the issue that triggered this so-called reflection process. The review process really grew from this feeling of a growing disconnect between the military and the political pillars of NATO. And I think that this report really offers an in-depth reflection on these particular challenges. You just mentioned, Rosa, that President Macron and the Secretary General of NATO, Stoltenberg, discussed yesterday, and obviously the focus was very much on that particular political dimension, NATO's unity, solidarity, and cohesion. And I wanted just to take a few seconds to tackle that. there is, I think, a clear understanding, and we've seen that in both Thomas de Maizière and Wess Mitchell approaches, a general agreement that NATO needs to work on its political cohesion. And this brings us to the foundations of what NATO is. It was initially a community of values, which made it possible to build a community of security. And so both pillars are totally intertwined. And you've noticed, of course, at several times of NATO's history, but particularly today, when NATO's political cohesion is weakened, then it becomes a weaker alliance, and it also loses a certain credibility when it has to, for example, confront other powers like Russia, or think of the Chinese challenges. And it also exposes the alliance to potential instrumentalization of member states by, spoilers or external powers that seek to destabilize the alliance. So this is really, I would say, the basis of what makes NATO. And if the basis doesn't work or is weakened, well, the entire military alliance is weakened as well. And the credibility issue to me is really, really important. And now, you mentioned the East Mediterranean. Obviously, there is a Turkey problem, and the Turkey question needs to be tackled much more seriously. And this leads me to the second point I wanted to make, and which I thought was really well put in the report, that we need to have more of these strategic discussions within these NATO circles, and to not hesitate to address hard questions. And if NATO is not used to address these hard questions, which today to me are very much linked to our political cohesion questions, then it doesn't really play its role fully. And I thought that the way this was tackled in the report was really well done, and this should be pushed much further. The other thing I wanted to address here, and Thomas de Maizière and Wess Mitchell mentioned it, is the NATO-EU cooperation in what you, I think, call rightly an era of strategic simultaneity. I really liked that way of describing our strategic environment, an era of strategic simultaneity, because it really tells you what world we're facing, which is that we're facing numerous interconnected challenges and threats, and at the same time. And so the alliance needs to face these challenges at the same time. And so this report has a full list of challenges. It's China, it's the southern neighborhood, it's maritime security, it's the digital challenges, it's climate change. And to me, this list of challenges are all issues that should be part of a strong EU-NATO agenda, because these are two organizations that very often share the same assessment of these challenges, and that should be working much more together. And to me, if we want to revitalize the transatlantic partnership, and I think there is an eagerness on both sides of the Atlantic to do so, there is a need for a genuine high-level EU-NATO dialogue. And there again, I thought that a few of the very concrete recommendations made in the report were extremely relevant. And which leads me to conclude, on the future of the alliance, of the transatlantic partnership, but also the future of US leadership under the incoming Biden administration, because everything is obviously linked. Of course, very much depends on the willingness of Washington to preserve and strengthen the alliance and the transatlantic partnership. But I would say it depends even more on what us Europeans can do more. And that, I think, is something that is increasingly being shared on both sides of the Atlantic. And that means what we can do more as Europeans among us, as we can do more with the United States, and what we can do more within a NATO framework. And so I think that, and the report showed it really well, we are moving towards a much more multipolarized international environment, where NATO will increasingly be an alliance among many other different alliances. So we are going towards a much more fluid approach to alliances, and we need to integrate that as well. And that's why we also need to be flexible in terms of the formats we will be using in the future in order to tackle these different challenges. And very lastly, because you asked about Macron and Stoltenberg conversation, the second item, that President Macron put forward, and it will not come as a surprise to you, was, the idea that European sovereignty, or the idea that European partners, eagerness to develop more capacities to act is part of the same package as strengthening the transatlantic partnership. I would really love us to get away from this false debate that strengthening European defense efforts is something that would undermine the transatlantic link or discourage the United States to continue to be invested in European defense and security matters. But so to move away from that debate, to move also away from the debate of burden sharing, which is something that doesn't resonate as something positive anyway, and that we've been hearing for decades and decades. And I would invite everyone to move towards a more positive debate on responsibility sharing. How do we share responsibilities among transatlantic partners in vis-a-vis our neighborhoods, vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis the digital challenge? And there you get to work on a much more positive agenda for transatlantic cooperation. So let me end on that.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. I agree 100% on the need to move out of this false dichotomy between European capability and the transatlantic relationship. That will be probably one key debate that is going to evolve here in Europe. And of course, because of the election results in the US, this is a very timely moment actually to come out with this report, because there's great activity in designing and crafting new ideas and new ways forward. I'd like to move now to the analysis of the strategic environment. Anna, feel free also to comment on other issues that pertain to the politics and the cohesion of the NATO alliance, but I would like you to examine and give us your assessment of how Russia and China are treated now as systemic threats by NATO. Russia used to be a strategic partner. China did not feature in these strategic documents. So it's quite a change. Although, of course, in other circles we have been talking about it. So can you perhaps give us an idea of what kind of intellectual leap forward this constitutes for NATO? And if you wish, given your role, maybe you could also give us a couple of indications of how this plays out in the Arctic, where, of course, all these actors come together, where the competition comes together, and it also intersects with another issue that the report mentions, which is, of course, climate change. So, Anna, I've given you a rather difficult task ahead, but I'm sure you can touch on all these points. You need to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Rosa and Carnegie Europe and NATO for the invitation, and congratulations to the expert group, to Wess, Thomas, and all your colleagues for this very interesting, thoughtful, and rich report. I read it with great interest. And I also had the honor to be able to talk to you in June, I think it was, and discuss with you, the whole group, a little bit more. And I kind of went back to that discussion and what we started off with when I thought about my remarks here, where to start. I think in June I lifted a few global trends that I thought were of particular interest for the group work. First of all, as we all have touched upon, the ongoing power shifts, as Rosa says, between the major actors of the world, the US, Europe, China, and Russia, and causing this need for NATO to increase the global approach, as Secretary General said, or global awareness, I think is an even better term for this. And secondly, then the growing battle between autocracy and democracy. And democracy being in decline in the world since 2008. And this actually affects directly the risk of war, since democracies tend to be less inclined to start wars against each other. And we need to put the protection of our democratic institutions at the core. And thirdly, the peak of globalization, or the free flows of globalization that has marked the era of globalization, I would say, with more of a questioning of dependencies worldwide, calls for autonomy, which affect production, supply chains, and also how we build resilience in the future, which in that case also affects technology, terrorism, pandemic, and so on. So this is a major issue. And then fourth, the inevitable effects of climate change, as you also mentioned, where nature becomes a force, a kind of an adversary that NATO also has to deal with in various ways. And I think all of these trends are reflected and kind of integrated in various ways in the report. I'm very happy about that. I think it's forward-leaning and it covers lots of perspectives that will be very interesting to follow up. So thank you for that. Now, I think I will focus a bit on China. As you mentioned, this is the new thing coming. The section on Russia, since I follow that closely, I'm situated here in Northern Europe, so Russia is the main issue for us, of course. I think it's correctly stated that looking out to 2030, most likely Russia will be the main military threat, and that's a very core component. And then the Russia strategy for NATO is pretty much worked up. I think the suggestions that are made there also indicate the right balance between being strong and then being able to pursue dialogue. But it has to be in that order. And that's also a main way of approaching it, which also applies to China. But the Chinese threat is very different to the Russian. It's also pointed out that it's first-hand not military for the Euro-Atlantic area or region, at least not as it looks now. But it might be even more significant because it is a systemic challenge that actually challenge this whole decade ahead. China with a global outreach, a global agenda, aiming at being a world leader 2050. And that affects a lot. I think for Europe, only in the past 2-3 years, the presence of China has been much more tangible. And Chinese actions and behavior have caused an increasing awareness regarding the Chinese intentions, while the US has been much more alert at an earlier phase, I would say, reflected already in the National Security Strategy from 2018. So far, it's fair to say that the US and Europe are not aligned on how to deal with China. And I think if you look at how the expert group assesses China, this reflects a signal of urgency in this regard. Chinese power poses an acute challenge, it says, for instance, and there's a critical need to increase political coordination at NATO to meet these challenges. So I read the report as a signal to take this, up front and forward and move forward on this. And I think fundamentally it's correct that the US and Europe must come together and defend the West against autocracy, understand the challenges and the nature of the Chinese threat. And that's really the key. You asked about the Arctic, and I think that's a great example, actually, because that's an area where China is much more present now, even though it's a non-Arctic state. It's not it doesn't have any territory up there. It's not present militarily, but it scans the area for business opportunities, invests a lot in research with a special interest on how the ice melts due to the climate change effects, how sea routes open up, and also possibly how natural resources then become much more available. So we see how the Arctic becomes part of the global great power competition. What used to be regional becomes global. But at the same time, even though 5 out of 8 of the Arctic states are NATO members, there are no discussions in NAC on the Arctic. And if you ask around in NATO on Arctic, usually it has been, well, you have to go to the capitals of these Arctic states. So there's been no common assessment. There is in the report on the military side some suggestions, but I would like to emphasize the need for political consultations. I think this is a great example where we would need NATO to have much more of a Arctic as a recurrent theme in the committee work, in the day-to-day working groups. Western security interest in the Arctic should be anchored into NATO. And, the whole of NATO should engage in what's happening in the Arctic. That way, NATO would function as an arena to discuss the geopolitical climate and lead the way towards a coherent Western security response to developments in this region. And I think it's on that strategic level that the expert group wants to move NATO. I think that's correct, because we need to have a common grasp of what's going on. You can't leave that to the northern states or to the southern states and divide it like that. You need to have a broader discussion. And the report has a range of suggestions in this regard, which I think are very interesting. Having common threat assessments, we've been working with that in the Baltic Sea area and the Black Sea. That has been very fruitful. Infusing the Chinese challenge, it says, into the structures of NATO. Using NAC for proactive strategic discussions and consultations in this regard. And also, as has been mentioned, use the partnerships in Asia and move them closer to NATO. I think that's also very interesting, interest-based discussions. Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, super interesting to have closer discussions on this. There is a suggestion on a coalition of democracies, NATO plus, so to say, to have discussions on Chinese matters. That's one possibility. Another one, which is not mentioned, is to have a NATO-China Council. That would be more of a road for dialogue with China, the same and a parallel to what we have with Russia. And I would perhaps add such a suggestion, actually. And then finally, strengthening resilience, very, very important. The first line of defense, as Secretary General said, and I think that's a super important point, a center of excellence for democratic resilience. It has to do with vulnerability of our societies and to be able to bounce back on attempts to split us and fragment. And that's very important. Then I just want to end up on perhaps looping back to what Alexandra also ended up on, but on the operational needs of the Chinese challenge, because this is also very interesting. Where and how should NATO engage with China if we take the political side apart? And there has been 2 tracks, actually. The Obama administration had this pivot to Asia, but did not move NATO into that discussion. The idea was more that Europeans would do more of the heavy lifting in Europe, and the US would pivot to Asia. Then the Trump administration has had a different approach, actually, linking the value of the transatlantic bond to the abilities of the allies to address a more assertive China. And then you would enter discussions such as, should NATO engage in freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea? What kind of capability should NATO have in this regard? And I think this is a pretty urgent topic to also move forward on, because it depends a lot on how you develop your capabilities ahead. And choices need to be made here, and priorities must be clear. To my mind, NATO is more of a regional organization. And if you have stated that Russia, which is just at our doorstep, is the main military threat, to my mind, the European contribution would be more to provide deterrence and to have a better grasp of security at home, so to say. Perhaps moving towards being able to meet a limited conflict with the state adversary, And in addition, being able to do more crisis management in our neighborhood, which is also in line with the EU ambition, actually, and to move those steps ahead rather than to move, across to the other side of the world. I think, of course, everyone wants to do everything all the time, but we need to make some strategic choices here. And therefore, I think NATO should develop its European pillar with this in mind. Go beyond the talks of unnecessary duplication, it's correct, but what do we actually mean? Who does what and where, and what do we need in order to do that? I think that burden sharing will come when there is transatlantic agreement on the responsibility sharing, which Alexandra put forward. But we need to realize that if we will continue to have a transatlantic community, there must be agreement within the community on the responsibility sharing. And that also involves, coming back to political consultation, more of decision sharing within the alliance. And that's also a tricky question, because we would need a new kind of leadership in order for that to work. And I will end there. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And you two were wide-ranging, and I saw everyone making notes. So I'm sure there'll be some points that perhaps Wes or Thomas might want to come back to. But I would also like to bring in the audience. Now, you can ask questions on the YouTube chat function or via Twitter, and some have already started to come in. So what I propose I do, I go through these 3 or 4 questions that have come in and ask you, each of you, to perhaps respond to them, picking perhaps, selecting what you'd like to discuss, and maybe also responding to some of the points that Alexandra and Anna have made, and then we'll go through another round of questions. So the first question, again, is about China, and it quotes the report saying that China must be unable to exploit differences between allies. But the comment or the question is, with allies seriously split on whether Beijing even poses a threat, how can you solve that and project power to Beijing? And I literally read the question out, so I'm not taking responsibility for the content, but it's about political cohesion and strategic convergence. We also have a question, and this enables us to reach out to other geographic parts of the world which are treated in the report. I have a question about the southern flank. How is it possible to write about the issue and not even mention NATO's main military operation in the Mediterranean, Operation Sea Guardian? And then another question, what about Iran? And inside NATO, what about members running roughshod over human rights, Poland, Hungary, and Turkey? So there's a mix of question about the outreach of NATO, but also, again, on political cohesion. So maybe we can go in the order in which we started, and I can invite Thomas to start and pick and choose some of the questions that were posed. And in the meantime, I'd like to encourage the audience to continue sending in questions and comments. I will read them out, and if you want to say who you are, you can. If you prefer to stay anonymous, you can. But we really want to engage with our listeners. So please, Thomas.
Okay, thank you. To be very short, first of all, thank you, Alexandra, for your remarks, very positive ones, especially from a French perspective. This is good to hear, perhaps surprising, but I must say Hubert Verdrien was an excellent member of our group, and so he worked hard, and I think his input was really good. I like your priority about responsibility sharing instead of burden sharing. You need both, because responsibilities are followed by money. So, but the priority is right. First, let's talk about responsibilities, and then talk about capabilities and burden sharing. So money is not a worth in itself, but it has a serving function for duties and responsibilities. So I like that very much. Now, Anna, and to others, we were very keen to make not a long report. We wanted to end with 50 pages. This was the limit, I think, from Ellen Albright. and we ended with 67 or 68 or so. So this was decision number one, not too long reports. Secondly, we wanted to make a strong analysis, but not a long one. We are not asked to make textbooks. So I think the relation between analysis and recommendations is, I would say, well, 30 to 70 or 20 to 80 or so, and this is exactly what we wanted. If we read all these papers from think tanks, it's normally the other way. 70-80% excellent analysis, and then some poor recommendations at the end. So we wanted it just to make the opposite. So sorry that some analysis perhaps is not founded enough, and this is an answer for others as well. We didn't mention all the missions. We didn't mention all the countries. We wanted to avoid fingerprinting on some allies. So if you can read, you can understand, but we definitely didn't want to mention, except of America and Europe, some countries within the alliance. So this was the reason for doing that. And then, Anna, we discussed the NATO-China Council. I don't know if it was your proposal. Others mentioned as well, and we said no. It's a formalism. The NATO-Russian Council is not a real good model, but we recommended to consider to build a special body. We didn't mention it. Perhaps a council, not a council with China, but perhaps a council on China or another special body. At least an instrument or a body where you concentrate all the discussions about China from all aspects, from all the committees, but not at this stage, at least, a NATO-China Council. And then, of course, we discussed the issues about missions or activities in the Indo-Pacific area, freedom of movement and things like that. But we said, and I think the Czech General made it very clear, we are a transatlantic defense alliance. We are not the world police for every conflict in the world. So we have to have a 360 degrees perspective, but our action are more or less founded on the transatlantic area. So we didn't put it in the report, but the mainstream was think global and act transatlantic, perhaps with an exception on fighting terrorism under special conditions, but not more. But of course, a strategic partnership with countries in that area allows us to at least have information sharing or so, but not in the way. It's a slippery road to talk about actions in this area there. So and I think Iran, we didn't mention Iran. In a way, it's put in our chapter, arms control and deterrence. We in the main findings, if you look at that, we couldn't mention all our recommendations, all the chapters, but if you mention everything, you don't prioritize. So this was the way how we prioritized, and this is not everything. These are my tough answers.
Thank you very much. And point taken on think tanks doing a little too much analysis. Wes, would you like to also respond to a wide range of issues, including the points made by Alexandra and Anna earlier?
Certainly, I would welcome that, and I'll try to economize my comments. A lot was said, and I agree with the vast majority of it, but maybe just hit a few of the points briefly. First of all, I want to say I very much agree with Alexandra, particularly her comment about strategic simultaneity. And I think what we have to capture, or what we tried to capture in the report, is not just the traditional NATO emphasis on 360 degrees, which suggests a kind of two azimuths, or look at all horizons at once. and almost respond reactively, or you look in all directions. In some ways, it conveys the opposite of prioritization. What we mean by strategic simultaneity is sustained pressure from two very large, purposeful military actors that have the large capabilities of large states. And that will require, at times, maybe strategic sequencing, various things, but certainly not just reacting to things as they emerge. And that's part of what we wanted to get at about the environment that NATO is increasingly in or is moving into. And so I substantially agree with what Alexandra has said, and I would just underline that because I think it's a leitmotif of the report that should be grasped. To Anna, I want to pick up on Thomas's point briefly about the NATO-China Council because it's an important one. Our group did debate that at length, and I think there were many reasons why we didn't embrace it, but I would underscore one because I think it's the most important, and it is that you first have to have the ability to consult about China before you can contemplate reasonably having a constructive consultation with China. And the view of the group is that NATO really is just at the starting point of beginning to get its head around the China issue, of converging on the bigger political questions of China, which one of the YouTube questioners has raised. And so I think we believe there is a fundamental discussion within NATO that's needed about how to characterize China and how to develop tools for dealing with China. And then and only then would an attempt at a structured dialogue with China have any chance of being productive, because it in a sense, a productive political dialogue is a derivative of a deeper political will and strategy that we believe it still needs to be formed. And then maybe just briefly, each of the three comments or questions that I heard from viewers, thank you all for those. I thought they were very smart questions. Just briefly on the first question about splits among allies on Beijing. Of course, to some extent that's true, but I would note a couple things. One is it's very fluid. And in fact, I think we already see convergence on key dimensions of the China challenge. We're in a different place in US-Europe discussions about China now than we were a year ago, or certainly 4 or 5 years ago. And I think in some ways, COVID and Chinese diplomatic and military behavior of the last several months has acted as an accelerant to a US-European convergence. I'm not going to say that we see completely eye to eye, but even in the deliberations of our group and with allies and experts, I have to say, there was not a deeply contentious debate within our group about China. I think there's an awareness on the basis of Chinese behavior of the challenge. And indeed, ultimately, we're asked to look out to 2030. And so hopefully what our recommendations will provide is both an example of how US-Europe convergence is possible, but also in the substance of those recommendations, they are meant themselves to aid in a convergence on China, which is, of course, an inherently political act. On the Mediterranean question, Operation Sea Guardian, I don't in any way downplay the importance of that operation, but I would just underscore again, we were asked to look out to 2030, and we were asked to emphasize the political dimension of the NATO alliance. And so there were certain things that were pressing in the headlines or that are important intrinsically, but were just beyond the remit of what we were asked to look at. And it's a similar answer in part on the third question. I heard a couple of questions from the third individual, but let me just pick up on what Thomas has said about some of the concerns about dynamics of human rights or democracy within NATO allies. I would just recall that the mission or the task of our effort was to provide recommendations for strengthening NATO political cohesion, again, out to 2030. The report deliberately does not mention allies by name, and that's true both whether it's of allies in Europe that there have been criticisms of, or the United States. Of course, we were aware of a lot of those dynamics. We weren't ignorant of them. But I think in a report like this, it's crucial that we be able to not talk about these issues in a way that the report itself becomes an implement of weakening political cohesion or giving wedges or openings even in messaging that the Russians and Chinese or others could exploit. And finally, I would just point out, I think there are, in fact, quite candid recommendations in the report that are describing many of the most challenging internal dynamics of NATO today. We didn't dodge them at all. I think we handled them professionally and in a balanced way. So we talk about the questions of democratic governance and make several recommendations, disputes between members, the saliency of single country blockages or allies developing military technological relationships with rivals or transatlantic tensions. We didn't dodge any of these. We weren't shy about any of them, but I think we wanted to provide recommendations that would actually increase cohesion rather than potentially inadvertently weaken it. So thanks again for those questions. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Alexandra and Anna, I'd like to invite you, and then I have 3 more very good questions. So let's make sure we have time to answer those as well.
Very quickly on the China question. The person who asked the question is right to say that we are not unified in qualifying China as a military threat in Europe. Most European partners still see China through the mainly economic lens. And that's a criticism that we are often confronted to when we are talking with American colleagues. There are two countries in Europe who have a military presence in the Indo-Pacific and a military strategy, France and the UK, and that's basically it. And this is where there is also a lot of cooperation between these 3 countries, between UK, France, and the United States in the Indo-Pacific. But I would say maybe a longer term lesson from the COVID-19 crisis is that this will also lead more Europeans to realize that, our over-reliance on China on many critical aspects, not only medical, but also digital and others, might have longer-term strategic and even military implications for Europe. And there I include also, the military mobility issue that was mentioned in the report. And this again leads me, to the idea of simultaneity, where everything is linked. Then I want to focus on the southern flank because I want to link also the comment to Sinan Ulgen's question, which just arrived, because he's asking, had Turkey demonstrated willingness to engage in a strategic political dialogue within NATO about Syria and Libya, would that have received the backing of all allies, including France? Yes, of course. I think here what we are facing is a troubling situation where the domestic politics is increasingly having an impact on foreign policy orientations of a few of NATO's member states. And that needs to be factored in much more. The other thing I wanted to point is that we've seen very recently a change in the American tone vis-a-vis Turkey. And there again, I think that the way the new Biden administration will position itself on the Turkey question will also be extremely decisive. And lastly, on Libya, on Iraq, on Syria, we have to be very clear that we cannot escape from talking and including Turkey when we are talking of the issues in NATO circles, because they are part of the setting of the situation. And so I think we should avoid falling in what I would call the trap of le fait accompli, and really have much more direct conversation among allies, because Turkey is a member of NATO. And if we cannot have conversations, even frank and directly and open among allies within the NATO framework, then I wonder, how we can use NATO if it's not done to address these, sometimes hard questions among allies. And that to me should be, I would say, a natural element and part of what we should be doing among allies, including in difficult situations such as this one.
Thank you very much. Anna?
Thank you. Yes, well, there was a question on what to do with the Chinese investments that have already been made on infrastructure and so on in Europe. I think that's a great question. I think it's far-fetched to think that we would just nationalize and throw them out. I don't, it doesn't seem like the European way of doing it. But the foreign investment screening mechanisms that are just being built up, I think, will actually be very useful in changing the way and making us consider these aspects better in Europe, in a way that we haven't done before. We just had Sweden recently screening or scrutinizing itself whether Huawei should be part of the 5G network buildup, and actually there was a no to that, which is a pretty bold decision for a mid-sized country. But that was purely out of security concern. That's what that would bring. So I think that's pretty interesting, and it wouldn't be possible a few years ago if you didn't have that kind of thinking of what does this actually imply. And I think this will make us move forward pretty fast on these issues, I hope. And that brings me perhaps back to the NATO-China Council, just to say that I agree completely on that. I mean, I think it's a valid point that we need to have a common ground first in order to be able to have a position of strength, to have a dialogue with China. But if you look at 2030, I think really we need to develop also the dialogue paths with China in a coherent way, and hopefully we have a much more of a solid ground together to stand on by then.
Thank you very much. I have quite a few questions here in the chat, so I'm going to try and synthesize them rather than read them out. So I have a question from Owen Lagadek on any lessons drawn from the 2010 group of experts report on how to implement the findings by NATO. I mean, of course, those are political decisions. I'd also just mention that Alexandra and Anna also responded to some of the questions in the chat, one about Chinese investments and the other about Syrian Libyan dialogue with Turkey. Then we have a question from Georgia, which I'm very glad to have. Post-Cold War, NATO is all about enlarging, and what are the prospects for strengthening NATO's cooperation with countries such as Georgia and Ukraine, which are both mentioned in the report. And then we have a question, a comment through Twitter about how NATO has shown joint and operational level superiority, but at the strategic level, we have seen a lot of uncertainty. And how can NATO improve its strategic level problems when it has to take rapid actions against rival actors such as China, Russia, etc. And then finally, a question. So it's about political decision making and deployment. Question from Sven Schwerzensky. Is strategic simultaneity not going to shadow divergences and contradictions between Russia and China for NATO to engage in a differentiated way, also making good of such differences for NATO? This one I did read out. So I'd go back to our speakers. I think we'll just stick to the same order. We have 10 minutes, so I suppose you can have 2 minutes each, 2.5 minutes each. And please, Thomas, the screen is yours.
Yes, very, very shortly on China again. I appreciate the critical tone of the questions. How can we have a strategy on China when we don't have the same opinion, same analysis, and so on and so forth? The answer is it's exactly because of that we recommend a strategic and open discussion within NATO about China. So this is important. You cannot only have discussions when the outcome is clear. So our fundamental recommendation is use NATO as a forum for common security interests. And on China, there is a common interest. How to deal with that? And the preconditions cannot be same analysis. Perhaps the outcome, but to discuss it, this is exactly the reason why we want a strategic approach on all the China issues. And for example, on infrastructure, it's the same. What we recommend is that you have a discussion on vulnerabilities. Where is NATO vulnerable because of China's activities, for example, on infrastructure, on harbors, on ports, and so on and so forth. And first you have information sharing, common analysis, and then perhaps you come to common actions or to common opinions, common statements. But you should not avoid it because in the starting point you don't have the same opinion. And then we don't overestimate the role of a strategic concept. That's true. It's written in our report. Strategic concept is not a panacea, but it helps, and the discussion itself helps. We recommend strictly and short time schedule to do so, ideally in 1 year, perhaps 2 years, not more. And the debate should not be an excuse not to change other things. But at least it's a good starting point for all of us, for all the NATO members, for all the allies, for the public to see that when international situation is changing, then NATO has to change his analysis, his strategy as well. And then the question on decision making in crisis, absolutely true, very good question. We made a recommendation there to, especially in crisis, to have quicker decision-making processes. We've heard and we learned, of course, that when it was really important after 9/11, the decision was made in 24 hours. That's true, and that was helpful and a good model. But perhaps we have crisis not as important as that. So there is a recommendation there as well. So to finish my remarks, I have the impression that some of the critical tone of the questions on our report is that there is not enough cohesion in NATO. But that's true. But our mandate was to overcome it, at least to address it, and with some implementations or recommendations to solve those problems on cohesion and solidarity and the lack of consultations. Over.
Thank you very much. And Wes, I'm asking you because Georgia was probably one of the countries that you were dealing with when you were Assistant Secretary of State. So maybe you could also address that. Certainly.
It's a crucial question. And by the way, I thought all the questions were good. Yeah. Let me be brief and try to start with that one. That, I think the group saw the report in a way as an opportunity for clarity on NATO's orientation towards its Eastern partners on a couple of levels. One, I think both in tone and substance, the report is very clear in affirming the open door policy, the Western prospects and path of Ukraine and Georgia, and of course in saying that NATO allies should substantially support vulnerable democracies like those that are under pressure from Russia internally and externally. And the second thing I want to stress, and I think this gets at the heart of the question, is the report is constructively critical of how NATO currently manages its partnerships, including its Eastern partnerships, that these are tremendously valuable tools, but they've also grown up or evolved in a sort of laminous fashion since the Cold War, in almost greenhouse conditions that didn't always impose a lot of rigor in how we utilize partnerships. And the result is that today you have partnerships at NATO, and you can think, for example, the partnership with Ukraine or Georgia, where the priorities and activities of those partnerships actually come about because of demand signals from the partners themselves, as opposed to coming from NATO. And you have very sporadic funding streams for these partnerships. There's no steady funding base, really. It's primarily voluntarily funded by allies who care about specific partnerships. And all of that, I think, lends itself to a somewhat non-strategic use of partnerships. So the report says, in essence, in an era of sharpened strategic competition, you need to be strategic about how you utilize partnerships, and you need a strategic blueprint. So if you want to strengthen the partnership with Georgia and Ukraine, you start by having a more systematic and strategic approach to how you're funding your partnerships, how you're utilizing them, and how you're communicating that to partners. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'll not give my responses to everything else that was said. I think I'll just restrict it to one other, and that is the comment that was made. I think it was the third question or comment, how to improve the strategic level abilities of NATO under tactical stress, as I understood the question. And this is a crucial point, and I'm glad that someone has picked up on it, because the report really stresses developing tools that in some cases don't exist in NATO at present to better take in that strategic view and to more proactively mitigate differentials in threat assessment. So we talk, for example, about a net assessment unit. We talk in the report about, obviously, as Thomas said, a new strategic concept that would outline the big strategic priorities of the alliance. But we also talk about a sort of purposefully returning a culture of strategy and strategic thinking to NATO that in some ways I think we've gotten away from. It's not a criticism, it's just an observation. Since the end of the Cold War, we have had more of a crisis management environment, and I think that shows, and that's a lot of what the report tries to address. Over.
Thank you very much. Alexandra.
Yeah, very quickly. On the decision-making process, one proposal which I found was really interesting and I suppose easy to implement was the one on having NATO being able to create a more structured mechanism to support the establishment of coalitions inside existing alliance structures. And this basically would enable allies to bring new operations under a NATO chapeau, even when not all allies may wish to participate in any resulting mission. And that, again, I thought was a pragmatic approach. Also, if there is a need for a quick response in a certain type of crisis, but having NATO playing this framework for coalitions of the willing or of the able, as you want to call it, when you need to have a quick action and not all allies agree on having a NATO mission. Now, the other question on Russia, China, how do we deal with these challenges? Yes, these are not the same challenges, but they require, if I can say, quite similar approaches, which is that it puts us, Europeans, Americans, NATO allies, in a sort of uncomfortable situation where obviously we will need to compartmentalize our relationship with these powers, which means that we will need, on the one hand, to confront China and Russia on certain issues, and the other hand, we will need to keep the dialogue and cooperation open on other issues. And from my understanding, the Biden administration is very in that approach, not willing to be in a 100% confrontational approach either with China or Russia, but finding ways of finding this equilibrium or difficult balance between dialogue and confronting on the other hand. And that's, I would say, is probably the most complex relationships to define because it requires differentiated style of cooperation and confrontation on the other side. And I don't see any other solution than just going through that sort of duality in both relationship with both powers.
Thank you. Anna?
Thank you. I will just comment very briefly on the partnerships. I think it's a very good and valid point that it needs to be much more interest-driven. Sweden and Finland are singled out in the report also and set as examples for others, and that has been the key, actually. The alliance and Sweden and Finland agreeing on that it's better for the defense of the Baltics if you also cooperate closely and develop the partnership in that regard, how to do those things. And that has been lacking with Georgia. I think one key issue for Georgia will be, there's been no movement on Russia with regard to Georgia and the position of NATO in this regard. The diplomatic efforts also to solve the situation of the occupied territories in Georgia. You need to move ahead in some direction there in order also to have a more of a long-term idea of what to do with the partnerships with Georgia and Ukraine, since both want to be members of NATO and you have an open door policy. You need to solve all those issues and then move ahead also with the partnership development, in my view.
Thank you very much, Anna. And we need to bring this discussion to a close with some regrets, because I think this has been a discussion that's been very wide-ranging, but also very focused. And it's quite extraordinary to combine this in such a short period of time. We've also had some very good questions from our audience, so thank you all for that. I would just like to make two very brief additional remarks. The first is that I think this report demonstrates yet again the value of expertise. The report dives into analysis, it dives into strategy, and it tries to make the findings and the recommendations adaptable to the real world. And I think this underscores, from my point of view, and I confess a vested professional interest in the value of expertise. It's important to engage with the expert communities. It's important to have fact-based recommendations that can drive political decisions, and it's not just ideology that is driving them. And the second point that I'd like to make, which comes up in the report, perhaps less so during the context of the discussion, but the reiteration of the importance of values, the community of values, and of democracy. And we're witnessing a change in narrative these days, and we need to see whether this narrative will actually be followed up through political practice, in the sense that it's not just NATO that needs to adapt its capabilities to a changing security environment. It's also that our democratic structures, our procedures, our principles need to be adapted and upgraded and improved to adjust to the new strategic environment. So these are my additional points. They're slightly, they're footnotes, shall we say, but for me, it's a takeaway from this discussion and from reading the report. I would like to thank all our panelists for joining us today. I would like to thank the 10 independent experts who worked on this project for the past 6 months. I'm sure they'll be able to participate in other events. For this particular one, it was the co-chairs representing the whole group. I'd like to thank the audience, of course, for staying with us and for asking such pertinent and sometimes challenging questions, which everybody appreciated. And last but not least, I'd like to thank my colleagues at Carnegie for putting this together. It's been really, there's been a lot of work behind the scenes that none of you can see, and also our friends at NATO for partnering with Carnegie on this specific event. So without further ado, I would like to bring this discussion to an end, and thank you all for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. Oh, you were brilliant, both of you. Alexandra as well, who's gone. Thanks.
Thank you so much, and thanks. Great discussion. Well moderated.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. I don't know where to end. Leave
studio at the bottom, yeah.